Long before modern plumbing, central heating, supermarkets, and clean water flowing from a tap, ordinary people lived very different lives. For a poor medieval peasant, the beginning of a day could be surprisingly quiet. There was no alarm clock, no electric light, no warm bedroom waiting for them. Instead, the day began when the darkness outside slowly started to fade. Inside a small cottage, a family lay close together on a thin bed of straw. The straw was dry when it had been freshly placed, but it was never particularly soft. Over time it became flattened and dusty. Bits of grass and straw found their way into clothing, hair, and blankets. For this family, the straw bed was not temporary. It was simply what they had. The cottage itself was small. Its walls were made from timber, mud, and whatever local materials could be gathered. There was little furniture, a rough wooden table, a few stools, some clay containers, a simple hearth, and in one corner the family's precious supply of food. There was no separate bedroom for each person. Privacy was a luxury. The whole family lived, worked, ate, and slept in almost the same small space. As the first pale light entered through the tiny window, the father slowly opened his eyes. The cottage was cold. The fire from the previous evening had almost disappeared. He sat up carefully, trying not to disturb the children. Beside him, his wife was beginning to wake. Their 2 children were still sleeping beneath a rough wool blanket. For a few moments, nobody spoke. There was no reason to hurry. The work waiting outside would still be there. The father rubbed his hands together. Then he reached for his worn clothing. His wool tunic had been repaired many times. Small stitches crossed the fabric where it had torn. His shoes were just as old. The leather had become thin from years of walking across muddy roads and hard fields. For a poor family, clothing was not something easily replaced. A garment was repaired, then repaired again, and when it became too damaged for one person, it might be altered for another. Nothing useful was thrown away simply because it looked old. The mother began preparing for the morning. Before breakfast, however, there was something even more important: water. Today, as on most days, the family had only a limited supply. There was no pipe beneath the cottage, no tap on the wall, no clean water waiting beside the hearth. Water had to be collected, and collecting it was work. The mother took a clay vessel and looked inside. Only a small amount remained. She poured some into a wooden basin. It was enough for basic washing, but not enough for wasteful use. Every drop mattered. For people living close to the edge of hunger and poverty, clean water was more than a convenience. It was a resource that required time, effort, and strength. The father lifted an empty wooden bucket. He was going to the village well. Outside, the morning was still cold. The wooden door opened with a quiet creak. A thin layer of mist rested over the muddy village path. The cottages around him looked almost identical, small, simple, and built from whatever materials could be found nearby. Smoke rose slowly from a few roofs. Somewhere nearby, a chicken scratched at the ground. A goat moved behind a rough wooden fence. Other villagers were beginning their own morning journeys. Some carried clay jugs, others carried wooden buckets. Everyone needed water, and everyone had to find it. The father started walking. The road was not smooth. It was a mixture of mud, stones, straw, and animal tracks. After rain, it could become especially difficult. A person carrying a full bucket had to walk carefully. One slip could mean losing the water that had taken so much effort to collect. Eventually, the communal well came into view. Several villagers were already there. They waited patiently. There was no convenient button to press, no machine to fill a container. A rope had to be lowered, a bucket had to be pulled back up, and the water had to be carried home. When it was finally his turn, the father lowered the wooden bucket into the darkness. He waited, then he pulled. The rope became heavy, his shoulders tightened, he pulled again. Slowly the bucket rose, water appeared beneath the rim. He had what he came for, but the work was not finished. Now he had to carry it home. A full wooden bucket was heavy, and the village was still waking. The father walked slowly along the muddy path. His hands tightened around the handle. With every step, the water moved inside the bucket. A little spilled onto the ground. He could not afford to spill much. At last, the familiar cottage appeared ahead. His wife was waiting near the doorway. She took the bucket carefully. The water would be used for many things: drinking, cooking, washing, perhaps cleaning a few vegetables. And if there was enough left, some basic personal washing. There was no abundance. There was only careful planning. Inside the cottage, the mother began preparing breakfast. It would not be a large meal. For poor medieval families, breakfast could be very simple: a little grain, perhaps some porridge, maybe an onion, a root vegetable, or a few wild greens. The mother placed a clay pot over the small fire. The children slowly woke. They sat together on the straw bedding, still wrapped in their blanket. The smell of warm food began to fill the little cottage. For a modern person, the meal might seem extremely plain, but to this family, it was enough to begin another day. The father sat beside the table. The mother divided the food carefully. The children received their portions first. There was no food to waste. Every spoonful had value. Every handful of grain represented something: a harvest, a season of work, a long winter survived, and sometimes simply luck. The family ate quietly. Outside, the village was becoming louder. Animals moved. Doors opened. People called to one another. Farmers began walking toward the fields. The day had started. And for this family, the real work was only beginning. After breakfast, the family separated for a while. The father had work waiting in the fields. His wife remained near the cottage with the children. There was always something to repair, clean, carry, or prepare. For a medieval peasant family, there was rarely a clear line between work and home. The cottage itself demanded attention. The animals needed care. The fire needed fuel. Food needed preparation. Clothing needed repairing. And water had to be collected again and again. The father stepped outside. He picked up his wooden farming tool and looked toward the fields. The path was already becoming busy. Other peasants were making their way toward their own work. Some carried hoes. Others carried baskets. A few led animals behind them. There were no engines, no tractors, no machines waiting to make the hard work easier. Most of the strength used in the fields came from human bodies. And those bodies became tired, very tired. The father walked toward the field. The soil was hard in places. He pressed the wooden hoe into the ground. Then he lifted it and struck again. The movement was simple, but it had to be repeated hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, day after day, season after season. The work of farming was not dramatic. That was precisely what made it exhausting. There was no single moment when the work was finished. A field had to be prepared, seeds had to be planted, weeds had to be removed, crops had to be protected. And eventually, everything had to be harvested. If the harvest failed, the consequences could last for months. Back at the cottage, the mother had her own work. She gathered the few things that needed cleaning. A wooden bowl, some simple clothing, a child's garment. Nothing was washed casually. Water was too valuable for that. She used a small amount and tried to make it last. The children watched. They were learning the same habits their parents had learned. Use only what you need. Save what can be saved. Repair what can be repaired, and never assume tomorrow's resources will be greater than today's. The mother poured a little water into a basin. She washed her hands, then her face. The children came closer. She used a damp cloth to wipe their hands and faces. It was not a bath. It was not a complete washing of the body. It was simply the amount of cleaning that could be managed with the water available. For many poor people, regular bathing was not a simple daily routine. Water had to be carried. Heating it required fuel, and fuel itself required work. So washing was often limited by what a household could afford in time, water, and firewood. This did not mean medieval people never washed. They did, but the experience was very different from modern life. There was no endless supply of hot water, no private bathroom, no shower waiting behind a door. Even the simplest act of washing could require planning. And then there was another problem: toilets. The family did not have a modern bathroom inside the cottage. A simple privy or other waste area would usually be located away from the main living space. Privacy was limited, comfort was limited, and sanitation was often difficult. The mother knew this better than anyone. Keeping the cottage reasonably clean was a constant battle. Waste had to be kept away from living areas as much as possible. But the village itself was full of animals. There was mud everywhere. And there was no modern sewage system carrying waste safely away. The smell of a medieval village could be very different from the smell of a modern town. Smoke, animals, wet earth, cooking fires, human waste, and decaying organic material could all become part of the air. For people born into that world, these smells were simply part of everyday life. They did not have the modern expectation that every street should be clean and every room should smell fresh. Their world was much more physical, much closer to soil, animals, fire, water, and waste. Behind the cottage, the family's simple privy stood apart from the main living area. It was made from rough wooden boards. Nothing about it was luxurious, but privacy, even limited privacy, mattered. The father used it when necessary. Afterward, he returned toward the cottage. Basic cleaning materials were whatever the household could obtain. Dry leaves, soft plant material, old cloth, moss, straw, or other locally available materials might be used depending on the place and period. There was no packaged paper waiting nearby. There was simply whatever nature, household scraps, or local materials could provide. This was one of the many small inconveniences that modern people rarely think about. In the medieval world, even the most private and ordinary parts of daily life required practical solutions, and almost every solution depended on what was available locally. The family had learned to manage. They had little, but they knew how to use what they had, and by late morning, the father was back in the field. The sun had risen higher. The morning chill was beginning to disappear. He gripped his wooden tool again, and the same movement began. Lift, strike, pull, move forward, then repeat. There was no shortcut, only another row of soil, another patch of weeds, another hour of work, and somewhere beyond the field his family was waiting for him to return. By late morning, the father's hands were beginning to hurt. The wooden handle had rubbed against his skin for hours. There was no padded grip, no gloves made for farm work, just rough wood against rough hands. Over time, the skin on a farmer's palms could become thick and hard. It was one of the quiet marks of peasant life. The body itself became part of the tool. He stopped for a moment and looked across the field. Other workers were doing the same kind of work. Some were bent over the soil. Some were pulling weeds. Others were carrying baskets or guiding animals. Nobody was working because they loved hard labor. They worked because food depended on it, and food was never guaranteed. A good harvest could mean a safer winter. A poor harvest could mean hunger. Sometimes the difference between the two came down to weather: too much rain, too little rain, a late frost, a summer that became unexpectedly cold, a disease affecting the crops. For a poor family, there were few ways to protect themselves from such things. The father finally sat down beside a rough wooden fence. He had brought a little water with him, only a small amount. He lifted a wooden cup and drank slowly. There was no reason to finish it quickly. The next water would have to be collected later. He looked at the remaining water. Then he put the cup away. Even when thirsty, he had to think about the rest of the day. Back at the cottage, the mother was working too. She had taken one of the family's worn wool garments and was examining a tear near the sleeve. The cloth had already been repaired several times. The original fabric was difficult to recognize beneath all the patches. She turned it over in her hands. Then she found a small piece of old cloth. It was not the same color. It did not matter. It only needed to be strong enough. She began stitching. A medieval household could not afford to replace clothing every time something tore. Clothes were valuable. Wool required animals. Animals required food. Food required land. Land required labor. So a simple tunic represented much more work than it might appear. When clothing became damaged, it was repaired. When it became too small, it could be altered. When it became too worn for ordinary use, parts of it might still be saved. Nothing useful was easily discarded. The children watched their mother work. The girl sat beside her and tried to imitate the movements. The boy was outside gathering small pieces of wood. They were young, but children in farming families learned practical work early. There was no separate childhood world filled with toys and scheduled activities. Children belonged to the household, and the household depended on everyone. The boy returned carrying a few dry branches. They were not large, but even small pieces of firewood were useful. The mother placed them beside the hearth. The family would need fuel later. Cooking required fire. Warmth required fire. Drying wet clothes required fire. And sometimes simply having a small flame inside the cottage made the difference between comfort and misery. Yet firewood was another resource that could not be wasted. The forest was not an unlimited supermarket. Wood had to be collected, carried, cut, and sometimes purchased or obtained through local rights. For a poor family, every bundle represented effort. By afternoon, the father returned briefly to the cottage. His clothes were covered with dust and soil. His hands were dirty. His face looked tired. The mother brought him a little water. He washed his hands first, then his face. The water quickly became cloudy. The amount had been small to begin with, but it was enough. He dried himself with a rough piece of cloth. There was no hot shower waiting for him, no comfortable chair, no clean change of clothes ready in a closet. He simply returned to work, because the field was still waiting. The mother watched him leave again. Then she returned to her own work. There was still food to prepare, clothing to repair, children to watch, water to manage, and the cottage itself needed attention. This was the rhythm of the day: work, rest, work again, and in between, small practical tasks that kept the family alive. By late afternoon, hunger began to return. The family had eaten only a small breakfast. The mother opened their food storage area. She looked carefully at what remained. There was some grain, a few roots, perhaps some dried beans, nothing abundant. She measured what she needed, not too much. The next day would come soon enough, and tomorrow would require food too. This was one of the hardest parts of poverty. It was not simply having little, it was having to think constantly about what little remained. A wealthy household could waste food without immediately noticing. A poor household could not. One extra handful today might become one missing handful tomorrow. So the mother measured carefully. Then she began preparing the evening meal. Outside, the light was slowly changing. The long working day was approaching its end. But for this family, the day was not finished yet. As the afternoon faded, the small cottage slowly began to change. The light outside became softer, the shadows grew longer, and the family began preparing for the evening. The father returned from the fields with the last of his strength. His wooden tool rested against his shoulder. His clothes were dusty. His hands were stained with soil. He had spent most of the day working outside, but there was still work waiting inside. He sat down near the cottage entrance. The mother brought a small basin of water. Again, there was not much. He dipped his hands into it. The water became dark almost immediately. He rubbed his fingers together, cleaning away the dirt that had gathered beneath his nails. Then he washed his face. It was a simple act, but after a full day in the fields, even a little clean water could feel precious. The mother took a rough cloth and helped brush the dried mud from his clothing. The family could not afford to wash every garment constantly. So much of cleaning involved removing dirt rather than completely washing the fabric. The same clothes had to survive another day, and another. Inside the cottage, the mother began preparing the evening meal. She opened a small storage container. There was not much inside: a little grain, some vegetables, a few dried ingredients. She looked at everything carefully. Then she began cooking. The meal would be simple, very simple. But simplicity did not mean it required no effort. The fire had to be started. The wood had to be arranged. The pot had to be placed correctly. The grain had to be prepared. The vegetables had to be cleaned and cut. And all of this had to happen after a long day of work. The children sat nearby. They were tired too. Their clothes were old, their shoes were worn, but they were used to it. In this world, children learned early that clothing was something to protect. A tear could become a serious problem. A lost shoe could mean walking barefoot, and a damaged garment might have to be worn for weeks before it could be repaired. The father took his shoe in his hands. A section of the leather had begun to separate. He examined it carefully. Then he found a piece of cord. With a simple tool, he began repairing it. There was nothing elegant about the repair. It did not need to look beautiful. It only needed to hold. That was the philosophy of poor medieval life in many ways. If something broke, repair it. If something became weak, strengthen it. If something could still be used, do not throw it away. The mother was doing the same thing with clothing. She took a worn garment and stitched another patch over an older patch. The fabric had become a history of previous repairs. Every stitch represented another attempt to make something last a little longer. Outside, the sky was becoming darker. The first evening sounds were spreading through the village. Animals were being brought closer to their shelters. Doors were closing. The sounds of tools were disappearing. People were returning home. For the peasants, the working day was coming to an end. But night brought its own difficulties. The cottage had only a small amount of light. A little fire, perhaps a simple oil lamp. There were no electric lights, no bright rooms, no way to illuminate the entire house at the push of a button. When the fire became weak, the room became dark. So the family stayed close to the hearth. The mother placed the evening meal on the table. 4 simple wooden bowls, 4 small portions. The food was most the grain and vegetables. There was no feast. No large piece of meat waiting in the center of the table. For many poor families, meat was not an everyday food. It could be something reserved for special occasions, depending on what animals they had and what their household could afford. The children began eating, slowly. The father ate quietly. The mother watched the children. She made sure they received their share. Every bit of food mattered. When the meal was finished, the mother did not simply throw away the bowls. She scraped them carefully. Any remaining food was saved. The wooden bowls were wiped clean, the table was cleared, the fire was adjusted, the cottage became quieter. Outside, darkness had completely covered the village. Inside, the family prepared for sleep. The father placed a few pieces of firewood beside the hearth. Not too many. They needed to save some for the morning. The mother checked the children. Their blankets were thin. The air inside the cottage was cold. The walls could block some wind, but they could not create warmth by themselves. The family climbed onto the straw bedding. They lay close together. Their body heat was useful. The blankets were pulled over them. The fire slowly became smaller. The room became darker. For the family, another day had ended. They had collected water. They had worked the fields. They had repaired clothing. They had prepared food. They had cleaned themselves with very little water. They had dealt with waste and sanitation using the simplest methods available. None of these things seemed extraordinary to them. This was simply life, a life built around scarcity, a life where every resource had a value: water, wood, food, clothing, light, even time. And tomorrow morning the same cycle would begin again. Morning would come again, and when it did, the family would wake in almost the same way. There was no dramatic beginning, no announcement that a new day had arrived. The darkness simply became lighter. A little gray light entered through the small window. The fire was almost gone, and the cold slowly made itself known. The father opened his eyes. For a moment he remained beneath the rough blanket. The warmth of the family was one of the few comforts available to them. Then he sat up. The straw beneath him made a soft, dry sound. The children were still asleep. The mother began preparing for another day. There was work waiting outside. But before work came another basic need: water. The family had used some of their supply the previous evening. So once again, water had to be collected. This was one of the strange realities of medieval life. Something that modern people receive almost without thinking could consume a large part of a person's day. The father took the wooden bucket. He stepped outside. The village was quiet. The path was damp from the previous night's moisture. A few early risers were already walking toward the well. The father joined them. The same journey, the same well, the same heavy bucket. Again and again, it was easy to think of water as something simple. But water had to come from somewhere. It had to be found, collected, carried, stored, and protected from contamination. The family could not simply use as much as they wanted. Every household had to think about its supply, especially during dry periods, and especially when the nearest reliable source was far away. After collecting the water, the father returned home. The mother poured some into a clay container. Some would be used for drinking, some for cooking, and a small amount would be reserved for washing. Nothing was wasted. The children woke. They were hungry. Breakfast was again small, perhaps some leftover grain, perhaps bread if the household had any, perhaps a little porridge. The exact meal depended on what the family had managed to grow, store, buy, or trade. For poor peasants, food changed with the seasons. In good months there could be fresh vegetables, fruit, eggs, or other local foods. During harder months, meals became simpler. Stored grains became more important. Dried foods became valuable, and families became increasingly careful about their supplies. The father finished eating. Then he stood. Another day of labor was waiting. He walked back toward the fields. The mother remained behind. The children followed her around the cottage. The work continued. She checked the firewood. She inspected the food storage. She looked at the clothing that needed repair. Then she went outside. The village was already busy. People were carrying baskets. Animals were being moved. Children were helping their parents. The smell of smoke hung in the air. The sound of wooden tools striking the ground came from the fields. This was the sound of ordinary medieval life. Not kings, not castles, not knights, just people trying to get through another day. The father reached the field. He began working again. The soil did not care that his back hurt. The crops did not care that he was tired. The work simply remained. He bent down, he pulled weeds, he lifted the wooden tool, he struck the ground, then he moved forward. Hours passed, his hands became dirty again, his clothes became dusty again, and the small amount of water he had used that morning already felt like a distant memory. For the family, cleanliness was never something they could take for granted. It was something they had to manage. A face could be washed, hands could be cleaned, a garment could be brushed, but a complete bath required much more. Water had to be carried, firewood had to be collected, water had to be heated, and the household had to find the time. For a poor farming family, time itself was precious. Every hour spent collecting fuel or water was an hour not spent working. This did not mean medieval people were unaware of cleanliness. They understood dirt, they understood smells, they understood that some things needed to be cleaned, but their options were limited by the world around them. A rich household could have better access to water, servants, heated bathing areas, and cleaner clothing. A poor peasant family had none of those luxuries. Their hygiene depended largely on effort, available resources, and local conditions, and sanitation was even harder. The family had no indoor flush toilet, no underground sewer carrying waste away, no easy system for separating clean water from dirty water. Waste had to be handled locally. That meant careful placement of privies, pits, drainage areas, and animal waste. But medieval villages were crowded with people and animals. Keeping everything clean was difficult, especially after rain. Mud spread everywhere. Animal waste mixed with the soil. Water could become contaminated, and unpleasant smells could linger around homes and streets. For modern people, this is perhaps one of the hardest parts of medieval life to imagine. We are surrounded by systems that quietly remove waste from our daily lives. We turn a handle. The waste disappears. We open a tap. Clean water appears. We wash our hands. The dirty water disappears down a drain. For a medieval peasant, none of this happened automatically. Almost everything required human effort, and that effort was usually performed by someone, often by the people themselves. The father continued working in the field. The mother continued working at home. The children continued learning the small tasks that kept the household functioning, and slowly another day moved toward afternoon. There was no escape from the routine, but there was something remarkable about it. The family had survived yesterday, they had survived the night, and now they were doing everything they could to survive today. Tomorrow would have to wait. For now, there was simply another field to work, another meal to prepare, another bucket of water to carry, and another evening waiting beyond the horizon. By afternoon, the village had settled into its daily rhythm. The strongest sounds came from the fields, wood striking soil, animals moving through the grass, people calling to one another across the distance. And beneath all of it, the quiet sounds of ordinary work. The father continued working. His body had already been tired for hours, but there was still more to do. He knew that stopping too early could mean falling behind, and falling behind could have consequences later. A field left unfinished was not simply an unfinished task. It could affect the harvest, and the harvest affected the entire household. For a peasant family, the year was connected by a long chain of work. The food they ate in winter depended on work done months earlier. The grain stored in autumn depended on seeds planted in spring, and the ability to survive a difficult season depended partly on how carefully the family had prepared. This was why farming was more than a job. It was the foundation of life. The father stopped briefly to straighten his back. He looked across the field. The horizon was wide. Beyond the fields were patches of woodland, small paths, and scattered homes. There were no tall buildings, no paved highways, no distant sound of engines. The landscape moved slowly. Almost everything happened at the speed of walking. He picked up his tool again, and continued. Back at the cottage, the mother had another problem. One of the family's garments had become badly damaged. The fabric around the knee had nearly worn through. She turned it over carefully. A new garment would be expensive, so she searched for another piece of cloth. She found an old scrap. It was smaller than she wanted, but it would work. She placed it over the damaged area. Then she began stitching. The needle was simple, the thread was precious. Her hands moved slowly, one stitch, then another. The children watched her. They were learning, not through books, not through formal lessons, but through observation. They were learning how to repair, how to cook, how to carry, how to save, how to survive. The boy eventually went outside. He searched the ground for dry branches. The previous rain had made much of the wood damp. Dry fuel was harder to find. He looked beneath trees and beside old fences. Finally, he found several small branches. He carried them home. They were not much, but the family would use them later. The mother placed them beside the hearth. Then she checked their remaining food. Again, there was not much. A little grain, a few roots, some dried ingredients. The family had to be careful. The next meal was already part of the calculation. This constant calculation was one of the hidden burdens of poverty. A poor person did not simply ask, "What do we want to eat?" They asked, "What can we afford to use today?" The difference was enormous. A family might have food but still be hungry, because the food they possessed had to last. If they ate everything today, tomorrow would be worse. So the mother measured the grain. She placed only enough into the cooking pot. The father eventually returned from the field. The sun was beginning to fall. His face was tired. His hands were dirty. His clothes were covered with soil. He sat near the doorway. The mother brought him water. He washed his hands, then his face. The children gathered around him. For a brief moment there was no work. The family simply sat together. These quiet moments were probably among the few peaceful parts of the day. There was no entertainment waiting, no television, no music playing from another room, no glowing screen. After dark, the world became quiet. People talked. They repaired things. They told stories. They sat near the fire, and eventually they slept. But before that could happen, the evening meal had to be prepared. The mother placed the clay pot over the fire. Inside was a mixture of grain and whatever vegetables the family could spare. The smell was simple, but warm food filled the cottage with a feeling of comfort. The father repaired his shoe while waiting. The boy helped arrange the firewood. The girl sat beside her mother. Everyone had a small role. The cottage was tiny, but it was their entire world, their shelter, their kitchen, their workplace, their sleeping space, and the place where the family gathered at the end of each difficult day. Outside, the village was becoming darker. One by one, the sounds began to disappear. The animals settled. The workers returned home. Doors closed. Smoke rose from the roofs. Inside the cottage, the family sat around their small wooden table. The meal was ready. 4 bowls, 4 people, 1 simple pot of food. There was nothing luxurious about it, but it was warm, and after a long day of work, warmth itself was valuable. The family ate slowly. Nobody wanted to waste anything. The children finished their portions. The father scraped the last pieces from his bowl. The mother carefully collected what remained. Even a small amount of food could become part of tomorrow's meal. Outside, the last light disappeared. The medieval village became quiet, and inside the little cottage, the family prepared once again for the night. Another day had nearly passed, and they had survived it.